When the Soviets decide to beat the US to Mars, 3 cosmonauts are locked in a test chamber for a year-long study. They learn that it's not the equipment that fails, it's the crew.
In Moscow, leaders are convinced that getting to Mars will definitively win the space race.
For the Soviets, putting a man on Mars would be a massive prestige win.
But a round trip to Mars would take a full year. At the time, no one knows whether humans can survive that long in space.
Moscow's Institute of Biomedical Problems hatches a bold experiment. They call it a year in a spaceship, but they run it at their labs in Moscow. The plan is to lock up a cosmonaut test crew for 365 days inside a cramped metal box.
They want to find out if the team can endure such a long space flight and what the scientists need to do to make it work.
Soviet leadership signs off on the space chamber plan. On November 5th, 1967, the top-secret experiment begins.
In order for this experiment to provide any meaningful results, the 3 cosmonauts are going to have to be actually isolated. The only contact that they will have with the outside world will be through a radio channel, and everything will be documented on film.
To the men locked inside, the chamber feels more like a prison cell than a starship.
There is no privacy. The living quarters are just 10 by 13 feet and not built for comfort. The crew has a table, a stove, some medical gear, and 3 flimsy fold-out bunks.
Soon, the conditions begin to take a toll on the cosmonauts, and the space chamber becomes a psychological pressure cooker.
Within a few weeks, all of them are showing signs of psychological stress. They're no longer enjoying any collective activities together. They seem to be almost at each other's throats all the time.
Within 2 months, the crewmen are not speaking to one another. If they're holding these churlish grudges against one another, they're not a cohesive team. They're not an effective team.
With the experiment at risk, the scientists take action.
They build a 200-square-foot greenhouse and dock it with the simulated mission.
The greenhouse gives them a little bit of dignity to get away from one another. It gives them something positive and constructive to do with their time, and suddenly, rather than being at each other's throats constantly, they're back to being a cohesive team again.
With the experiment back on track, the scientists decide to stress test the crew. They simulate a failure of the chamber's life support systems.
The Soviet lab administrators massively raised the concentration of carbon dioxide in the capsule.
They crank the temperature up to 86 degrees. They push the humidity to a tropical 90%.
All of the subjects are suffering from headaches and exhaustion.
It feels like hell in space.
The extreme conditions force the crew to cooperate. On November 5th, 1968, after a full year inside the space chamber, the experiment comes to an end.
The most important lesson learned is that claustrophobia and monotony are 2 of the biggest challenges a cosmonaut crew will face on the way to Mars.
For years, the full details of the secret space chamber experiment remain buried deep in Kremlin files. It's not until 1975 that they're finally revealed to the world, when cosmonaut Andrei Bozhko publishes his memoir.
He actually describes the feelings that he and his fellow participants had living inside this tiny capsule for a year.
Although the cosmonauts never actually leave Moscow, the lessons learned from the experiment prove useful for planning future space missions.
If we're going to send somebody to Mars, you can't just simply put them in a capsule and expect them to endure a 34 million mile voyage. You have to provide more space for them. Otherwise, the mission's going to fail because the individuals are going to fail.
Next, the War Department begins an extraordinary experiment, intentionally starving healthy American volunteers.
By 1944, Allied forces are ashore in Normandy. They're driving the enemy, and they will soon be in Germany itself.
Allied leaders are about to face a new challenge. Millions of civilians across the war zone are on the edge of starvation, and it's going to be the job of the victors to feed them back to health.
To be prepared, they need to understand how people's metabolism changes as they experience malnutrition, and that has never been studied properly.
Enter Dr. Ansel Keys, a physiologist at the University of Minnesota and special assistant to the U.S. Secretary of War.
To solve the famine problem, Keys proposes a dangerous and controversial experiment. He wants to do a controlled study under lab conditions of human starvation and recovery from starvation.
The War Department likes the plan and gives Keys its backing. Now he needs volunteers who are willing to starve for their country.
To get useful results, Keys wants to use healthy young men for the experiment, but most of those are off fighting in the war, but not all of them. Keys identifies an untapped pool of healthy young men who are still in the US, conscientious objectors.
Keys recruits using a brochure signed off on by the War Department. On the cover is a picture of starving children, with the text reading, "Will you starve that they be better fed?" It's an emotional appeal, but it works.
More than 200 men volunteer. Keys picks 36 of the healthiest and most psychologically stable candidates to be his guinea pigs.
He sets up a facility literally underneath the bleachers at the University of Minnesota so that the men are away from prying eyes.
In February 1945, the starvation phase of the experiment begins.
To start, he slashes the men's daily calorie intakes in half.
Keys wants to impose a reduced calorie intake, but also make the subjects burn more energy by exercising. So he puts them through the Harvard Fitness Test, which is a series of exercises that are designed to push people to the limits of their endurance.
The effects of starvation are swift and shocking.
The subjects drop around 20% of their body weight in the first 12 weeks. Their ribs are sticking out. They've got no energy. They're just wilting.
One subject gets himself trapped in a department store's revolving door. He's just too weak to push himself through.
And it's not just physical. As the weeks go by, the starving subjects are getting irritable, they're getting depressed, and not surprisingly, they become totally obsessed with food.
Two men get into a physical brawl in a canteen line over a scrap of pasta. That's how complete this obsession with food becomes for them. They're fighting even over a couple of scraps.
One individual starts having visions of cannibalism, he's fantasizing about food, and he reaches the limits of his mental endurance.
Look at that generous helping of rich, juicy barbecue.
He actually sneaks out of the study, goes into town, and engages in a massive caloric binge in the form of milkshakes and ice cream sundaes.
After 6 months, the starvation phase finally ends. Next comes the refeeding.
Keys believes that by gradually increasing the subject's calorie intake, he can safely feed them back to health without triggering any negative reaction.
He splits the subjects into 4 groups, and the different groups get different amounts of extra food. Some groups are also given extra protein and vitamins, while others just get the base amount of carbohydrates.
Now a new and dangerous problem arises.
Their body weight continues to plummet, even though they're re-nourishing these test subjects.
Keys discovers that the men are shedding retained edema fluid that's been masking just how much weight they've lost. This is a potential disaster for the study.
To get the experiment back on track, Keys decides to supersize his portions.
He just doubles the calories for the groups. And to the relief of the scientific team, it works. The men finally begin to recover.
Keys realized that in refeeding a starving population, vitamins and protein were really a luxury. It was the calories that mattered. They needed at least 4,000 calories a day.
Keys passes that information on to the War Department, who immediately put it to practical use in post-World War II Europe.
Keys wraps up the experiment in October 1945, but his complete findings remain hidden. It's not until 5 years later that he finally reveals the data in his masterwork, The Biology of Human Starvation. The results of the starvation experiment are used worldwide in famine relief.